for a game that nobody knew about to the same game blowing up several years later, taking the internet by storm in the process, to then finally losing almost all of its popularity, why is Among Us no longer Among Us? Recently, I was at my friend's Among Us themed birthday party. He just turned 18, so comment a happy birthday message to him below. He'll appreciate it. But anyways, it was there when I started thinking more about the game itself. What happened? At Among Us's peak, millions of players streamed, played, and talked about the game. It was a fun, cartoony murder mystery type game that you play with your friends, versus now, where the game's player base resembles more of a graveyard, with the game slowly declining into oblivion. In this video, we'll be looking at why Among Us died, as well as the attempts at reviving itself and the theories on where the game could head towards. To understand the rise and fall of Among Us, we have to look back at its inception, to 1986. In 1986, psychologist Dmitry Davidov created a party game called Mafia at Moscow State University in the country of Russia. It might ring a bell because you've probably played Mafia at a party event, or like me, played it at a summer camp when they were little. Mafia, also known as Werewolf, was mainly to combine psychology with some fun in the context of teaching high school students the basics of human nature. In its simplest form, in Mafia, there are two groups. One is the uninformed majority, and the other is the informed minority. The majority are the innocents in this game, while the minority represents the murderer or murderers, also known as the imposters. In the counterpart version of the game, Werewolf, it goes like villagers versus werewolves. Already, this should begin to sound like a familiar game that you clicked on this video for, but in Mafia, the goals of the innocents are to figure out who the bad guys are, at the same time as trying to survive, while the imposter or imposters try to take everyone out without looking too suspicious. Mafia and Werewolf both have a day and night cycle. At night, the minority chooses who to kill while everyone else is sleeping with their eyes closed, and during the next day, the people have to figure out who did it, aka the innocents. The game keeps repeating this process of day and night until everyone is either killed and the minority murderer wins, or the murderer is caught by whoever has the detective role in the majority. And in more interesting takes on this game, there is also a medic that can revive people, as well as the presence of other participating roles. Eventually, this game created in Russia spread from colleges to colleges and eventually around the world. And this is how the party game fell in the lap of the developers, InnerSloth, where one of them played it as a kid. And so, they finally had an inspiration for Among Us. Before Among Us was ever created, there were games that had already taken on the premise of a murderer in the presence of innocence, such as through the famous renowned board game Clue, or in video games such as Murder Mystery on Roblox and Minecraft. These games drew immense popularity for its time. InnerSloth, known for their successful development of the Henry Stickmin franchise, of course, as mentioned before, got wind of this online rise in Mafia and began development of Space Mafia in 2017, their working title, putting their Stickmin development on hold. To make the game more interesting, they wanted to set the premise in outer space, and during the development, they eventually changed the name of Space Mafia to what we know today as Among Us. A couple months later, in June of 2018, Among Us was officially released to the public through mobile, and it was a flop. Very few people knew, cared about, and played the game. The player base was under 100. There were multiple reasons for this. The game was exclusively on one platform and there were no multiplayer servers. An Among Us game designer reflected on this years later, stating, "We're really bad at marketing. When we first launched our Twitter, for example, we would make a tweet about Among Us on Twitter and no reaction at all, like actually 0 likes." Yet, against all logic and reasonable thinking when objectively looking at the costs versus benefits, as humans are, the Among Us creators continued developing the game. Slowly throughout 2018 and 2019, more features were added that began to resemble the Among Us that we know today. The game was released on Steam as something paid, and this sound was added, which of course is memed a lot even now, but at the time this was crucial to its marketing later on at its peak. More maps were added, but most importantly, multiplayer. As Among Us started gaining a few hundred players every few months, all the effort wasn't completely for nothing, because something happened in March of 2020 that shut the entire world down. COVID.
COVID-19, a mysterious new virus.
Now dead and nearly 10,000 confirmed cases.
And as tonight, the death was an elderly person.
It wasn't that Among Us immediately skyrocketed the instant COVID happened, but a series of events occurred. For an unprecedented time period, people were forced to stay indoors with nothing else to do. A few viewers recommended the game to their watch Twitch streamers, which began to kick off Among Us's popularity. As said before, for those with nothing else to do during quarantine, many tuned into VODs and live streams of their favorite streamers playing it. As more and more people heard of it, the compound effect kicked in. Among Us blew up as a seemingly overnight success. Despite social distancing, the game became a substitute for physical social interactions with friends. With no story, it was simple and easy to understand. Anybody could jump right on in. The mindless nature of doing tasks helped alleviate lots of collective trauma during the pandemic. There wasn't just a pandemic that was going on, keep in mind, but lots of social unrest that manifested into movements, such as Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate. Not to mention, a looming presidential election for hundreds of millions of Among Us's players in the United States was just around the corner. Ironically, with the hindsight of now, speaking of American politics, the game itself contributed to one of Twitch's highest ever concurrent viewerships, with the US representative AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ilhan Omar playing the game with streamers such as Pokimane and Hassan Piker, drawing 700,000 live viewers. All of this in an effort to turn out young voters in the upcoming presidential election. Around this time, Among Us hit 100 million downloads and peaked in its player base at 3.8 million. To truly grasp how much of a cultural impact Among Us has had on society, still to this day, the term sus, abbreviated for suspicious or suspect, is floated around, especially in younger circles. In 2022, Merriam-Webster even added the word sus to its dictionary. With a responsive development team that had sacrificed so much, even for a much smaller audience back in 2018, this time, they had much more to give for a player base that granted them much more resources and money to fund their ambitions. However, with a popular game came headaches as it brought hateful players to the game. Hackers started to descend upon the lobbies of the game. Some players died and then came back to life using cheats. Most notably during this time, before the 2020 presidential election, there was a hacker known as Eris Loris who hacked lobbies and spammed vulgar and political things in-game. In an interview, he stated, "I'm a college student, and I support Trump. With the election and this hopefully getting publicity, wanted to add that." He went on record claiming that his hacks impacted almost 5 million players in 1.5 million games, and this was so bad that the official developers of the game took notice and issued a warning regarding the incident. Of course, parents became worried about what their child was playing, as many of the player base of Among Us were kids. This plus the simplicity that made the game what it was also contributed to the game's downfall. Coupled with repetitive tasks, no real sense of progress, for many the game became stale. It was inevitable that people would stop playing. Less players meant less fun in the game itself and longer wait times in public lobbies. As the world returned back to in-person activities, it was harder and harder to get several friends to play Among Us together. Not to mention, the game being paid added a barrier of extra entry for any new player that had never heard of the game that wanted to play the game during its fall period. Think about it. There already are few incentives to play a lesser known game, especially one that arose because of its multiplayer feature. The fact that the game itself was also paid made it harder for many possible children that grew up post-COVID to ever set foot on the soils of the game's spaceship. And with a much smaller fanbase that was dedicated enough to still stick around, perhaps this was for the best. With all said, there have been efforts to revive the game. InnerSloth added a Henry Stickmin map to stimulate nostalgic feelings for a return to the game, which for the short term was relatively successful. There was also the launch of Among Us in virtual reality, which also helped, but none of this lasted long. Who knows? Since many of Among Us's players during the pandemic were children, we could see a resurgence in the game in the next half to full decade due to nostalgia, similarly to what happened with Minecraft back in 2019 when most people credited PewDiePie for its revival. Among Us may have died, but it provided millions of people across the globe memories of a bygone quarantine era. But Among Us is still beloved. Despite Among Us 2 getting cancelled, there are still exciting developments for players to look forward to. This is not to say that there isn't a player base for Among Us still. But perhaps though, this was for the better, as the community became more personal and close-knitted. And if you want to chat or bounce YouTube tips and ideas with me, I have a Discord in the link below. What are your thoughts on Among Us? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.